Hey there, neighbors. Just a quick request before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short form content on places like Instagram and TikTok, and then reposting that stuff to places like Threads and X and Facebook. So if you would, go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, and in the contact section, all the social media links are there. Stop on over and check out some of the short form content. It tends to be a bit more lighthearted, at least some of it, more comedic than the heavy podcast episodes. But I would love to have you stop by, and if you'd be so kind to like and follow what you see. Thank you very much. And on to the episode. All right, so I want to start off with something unusual. I want you to imagine that Rachel Maddow from, MSN, BC, or whatever it's called now. Imagine Rachel Maddow started something called Maddow University. Not a podcast, not a streaming show, not just a YouTube channel that everyone understood was political commentary. I mean, Maddow University. Now imagine what it did was make animated videos for kids, worksheets, lesson plans, classroom guides, free materials for teachers with bright colors and clean graphics and friendly narration, everything packaged in a very educational way. And imagine those materials explained American history and capitalism and racism and climate change and immigration, religion, patriotism, whatever, and what it means to be a good citizen, all from a very clearly progressive point of view. Then imagine blue states start approving these materials for use in their public schools. And my question is this: how long do you think it would be before conservative media lost its entire mind? Not a little, not just mild objection. I mean full emergency mode. There would be hearings, there would be fundraising emails, there would be school board speeches delivered, with the emotional restraint of a man trying to defuse a bomb. Fox News would have a chyron before the first worksheet even finished downloading. And honestly, I don't think that they would be wrong to ask questions. If an openly progressive media organization branded itself like an academic institution, built materials for kids, tried to move those materials into public classrooms, conservatives would know exactly what to call it. It's the word they love: indoctrination. Propaganda. They would say, you are not just teaching kids, you are shaping them. And this is what makes this conversation today so revealing, because when the politics are reversed, suddenly the same alarm system doesn't seem to be working. Prager University is not actually a university. It is not accredited. It does not offer degrees. It is a conservative media organization that makes polished, educational-looking videos. Its own FAQ says it is not an accredited university and does not offer degrees. It says it provides educational, entertaining, pro-American videos for, quote, every age. And now PragerU is introducing PragerU Kids, which offers classroom resources for K through 12 students, including lesson plans, videos, and worksheets. PragerU's educator page describes these as free, ready-to-use supplemental materials for teachers. So the question is not whether conservative ideas can ever be discussed in schools. Of course they can. Students should learn about conservatism, liberalism, socialism, capitalism, religion, secular government, civil rights, labor, war, dissent, all of it. The question is why the movement that screams so loud about indoctrination whenever a school teaches an honest history lesson or acknowledges LGBTQ people exist or discusses racism, now they suddenly become very comfortable with an openly conservative media organization that's building material for children and walking it towards the classroom. That's the contradiction, and it's anything but subtle. The people who warned us that politics were invading schools seem to have built their own political product, attached a worksheet, and called it education. Hello, neighbors, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, a podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about Prager University. Now, I'm working under the assumption that many of you might have heard of PragerU, maybe seen a commercial or some of their social media posts, but that many folks don't really have a good understanding of this organization that is increasingly attempting to insert itself into schools, public schools, as an educational aid. Now, before we get into the school angle, I want to slow down and define the thing. Because, as I said, you may have heard the name without really knowing what it is. And, maybe it has something to do with conservatism, Dennis Prager, who it's named after, and, these short videos. That is about where many people are. So plainly, PragerU, or Prager University, is not a university in the normal sense. It is a conservative media nonprofit founded by Dennis Prager and Alan Estrin. Its format is simple and effective. Short, polished videos that explain political, cultural, economic, historical, moral questions from a conservative perspective. The name matters. Prager University sounds neutral. It sounds academic, of course, university. It sounds like a place where people study and debate and cite sources and, maybe have to pay too much for parking. But again, PragerU says, it admits it is not an accredited university and does not offer degrees. Now, that does not mean that it has no right to exist. Conservative media is certainly allowed to exist. Conservative arguments are allowed to exist. Dennis Prager is allowed to have opinions. Donors are allowed to fund the videos. Adults are allowed to watch them, share them, argue with them, or, send them to, their friends and relatives with the subject line, "This explains everything." That is not the issue. The issue is branding and context. When political advocacy calls itself a university, it borrows academic credibility. It gives ideological content the posture of instruction. It doesn't merely say, "Here's our argument." It suggests, "Here is the lesson." And that difference becomes much more important when the audience is kids. Adults, we can choose our media, at least in theory. We can ask who made something, who funded it, who was left out, whether the argument is persuasive. Kids are still learning how to tell the difference between fact and opinion, interpretation, framing, persuasion. And that is why PragerU Kids changes the stakes. PragerU Kids is not just a playlist sitting quietly in some corner of the internet. PragerU promotes K through 12 education resources, including lesson plans and videos and worksheets and materials organized by grade and subject areas like civics, history, financial literacy, life skills. that means we are not only talking about media. We are talking about materials that are designed and advertised to be used as education. And once you are in that world, the standard needs to be different. A political video on YouTube is one thing. A classroom resource is quite another. When something enters a school, even as optional supplemental material, it picks up authority from the room. Students do not experience it just as, some political video found online. They experience it as part of the lesson. That is why the word supplemental should not make everyone, lose interest or fall asleep. Supplemental materials can shape what students hear. Teachers use outside resources all the time. Videos, handouts, articles, maps, primary sources, museum materials, civics explainers. Some are excellent, some are lazy, some are biased. Some are useful only if the teacher is adding context. So the question isn't, can teachers ever use outside material? Of course they can. The question is whether an openly ideological organization should be treated as a neutral education provider, especially by the very political movement that has turned, indoctrination into its favorite smoke alarm. And to be precise, I'm not saying that PragerU has taken over public schools. I'm not saying every child in America is being forced to watch these videos. I'm not saying every approval partnership or vendor listing or resource portal means the same thing. Those distinctions matter. But PragerU has clearly tried to move beyond adult political media and into the education ecosystem. Florida approved PragerU lessons for K through 12 schools in 2023. And reporting at the time described the materials as approved for classroom use while also noting uncertainty about whether they would actually ever be used. PragerU itself maintains a state announcements page promoting state-level education wins and describing some of the materials as optional educational resources. So no, this is not in every classroom. But at the same time, it is not nothing. It is an attempt to gain legitimacy inside of public education. And that, I think, is where the central problem begins. Because if the organization were called what it, functionally is, a conservative media project for children and adults, the debate would sound very different. But when you call it Prager University, package it as supplemental education and use the language, of values and civics, suddenly political advocacy, it just gets a much cleaner jacket. And that's the move. That's it's not hidden, it's not complicated, it's just effective. And once you see that move, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why is the anti-indoctrination crowd so comfortable with this? The classroom angle is what turns PragerU from another conservative media outlet into something more serious. Because, as I said, political videos online are one thing. Classroom materials are another. If an adult watches PragerU on YouTube, that adult is choosing the media. Maybe wisely, maybe not, but they're choosing it. They can click away. They can compare sources. They can decide whether whatever the argument is, whether it holds up. A child in a classroom does not have that same relationship to the material. When a video appears in a lesson, it comes with the authority of school attached to it. The kid is in school. Even if the teacher describes it as supplemental, do kids even really hear that word? Even if it's optional, even if it's just 5 minutes long. To a student, the message is pretty clear. This is part of what we are learning in school. That is why supplemental materials matter. And PragerU Kids is built for that space. Their educator resources page offers teachers lesson plans, videos, worksheets, other materials for K through 12 age groups. The subjects, as I said, include civics, history, financial history, life skills. And again, those subjects sound harmless in isolation. Nobody is against kids learning civics. Nobody is against kids having financial literacy. And you know, nobody should be against history. You know, so the issue isn't really the subjects. The issue is the framing. Who is telling the story? What is getting emphasized? What's getting minimized? What assumptions are being treated as common sense? And, you know, what questions are never asked? That matters because classrooms are full of supplemental material, and teachers use outside resources all the time. So yes, free ready-made material can travel. Not because teachers are lazy. Teachers are exhausted. There is a huge difference. Free material that is polished and searchable and organized by grade level and tied to standards has an advantage. If it also gets state approval or appears on a state education site, it gets even more legitimacy. That is why the state level movement matters so much. As I said, Florida approved PragerU Kids material for use in 2023. The Florida Department of Education said the materials aligned with state standards, while, you know, critics argued the content was, you know, very much ideological and, from a historical standpoint, misleading. Oklahoma's top education official announced a partnership with PragerU the same year. New Hampshire approved some PragerU financial literacy materials for credit towards graduation requirements. PragerU has also promoted additional state-level approvals and partnerships on its own site, and you can go and check those out if you like. And you know, we need to be careful here. These arrangements are not all identical. Approved, optional, supplemental, partnered, aligned, available, and required. These are all very different words, and we should not pretend that they're the same. In most cases, we're not talking about PragerU replacing any official curriculum. We're talking about doors opening, resource lists, optional materials, state-level encouragement. But to say that that's not meaningful, I think, is a mistake. You do not have to replace a textbook to influence what a student hears. You can enter through a 5-minute video and a worksheet, whatever. You can enter through the material that fills the gaps between the big official lessons. And this is where the long game starts to show. The goal is not necessarily to have a child come home tomorrow quoting Dennis Prager at the dinner table. That, of course, would be too obvious. And also, most children are busy explaining, you know, why their shoes got wet on the way home, or, you know, why they still haven't cleaned their room. The goal here is much slower. Make certain ideas feel normal early. Make certain suspicions feel natural. Make one version of American history feel patriotic, and make another version feel hostile, I guess is the best word to use. Make capitalism feel like freedom itself. Make empathy seem noble only until it asks something uncomfortable of you. Make these quote-unquote traditional values sound neutral while inclusion sounds political. That's how worldview building works. It does not always announce itself as a campaign. Sometimes it arrives as a resource. And this is why the conservative reaction to PragerU and PragerU Kids is so revealing. These are the same people who understand perfectly well that classrooms shape children. This is why they fight over libraries. This is why they fight over curriculum. This is why they, argue over history standards and teacher training and school boards and whether pride flags should be within 1,000 yards of a school and how kids' pronouns are used and, books that have Black or gay characters. They know education shapes assumptions. They know early stories matter a lot. Their issue is not that children are being shaped. Their issue is who gets to shape them. Because if they truly believed that political advocacy had no place in public classrooms, they would be skeptical of PragerU Kids as well. They would ask who made the material and who funded it and what scholarship supports it. They would ask what gets omitted and whether kids are being given tools to think or conclusions to just simply absorb. But instead, the right, generally speaking, treats PragerU very differently. When the lesson challenges conservative comfort, it's labeled as indoctrination. But when the lesson protects conservative comfort, now it's education. And that double standard is pretty much the meat and potatoes of what I want to talk about today. This is where the hypocrisy stops being subtle. For years now, the right has told us that public schools are being used to indoctrinate children, and it's like a drumbeat that they march to. Again, library books with a gay character is grooming. A history teacher who explains that slavery shaped American law and wealth and politics. Suddenly children are being taught to hate America. A school talks about systemic racism, and the conservative media ecosystem acts like Karl Marx, was hiding in the teacher's lounge. The word is always indoctrination. It gets used for almost anything that challenges the preferred story. You talk about LGBTQ students, honestly, indoctrination. You talk about race beyond just the mere fact that slavery happened, and then Martin Luther King fixed it, it's indoctrination. You talk about climate change in a way that doesn't flatter the fossil fuel industry, that's indoctrination. You talk about inequality or labor rights or poverty as something more complicated than someone being lazy. That is indoctrination. And I'm not going to lie, indoctrination can be a real concern. Public schools should not be partisan training camps. Teachers should not be using classrooms to campaign for candidates. Students should not be pressured to adopt a teacher's politics. A classroom should not be a place where children learn what party to join. Maybe that's the simplest way to say it. They should not be learning which party to join in a public school classroom. That is not education. But that is also not the standard the right is actually applying. Because if the concern were truly keep political advocacy out of classrooms, then PragerU Kids would trigger the exact same concern. And it does not. That is the tell. The same people who can detect left-wing bias in a library display from 3 counties away suddenly become, very snowblind when a conservative media organization builds classroom materials for children. Suddenly now everything is nuanced. Now it's optional, it's supplemental, it's traditional values, it's financial literacy, it's civics. And some of those words, may be technically accurate in specific contexts. Optional means optional, supplemental means supplemental. Financial literacy is a real topic, and I think an important one that I know I didn't get enough of when I was in, high school. Civics, of course, is real, but none of those words erase the political stuff inside the material. That's the point. A lesson does not become neutral because it comes with a worksheet. A video does not become nonpartisan because, the narrator sounds confident. An ideological project is not harmless simply because it throws in words like values. And all education involves values. That is unavoidable. Schools teach that evidence matters. They teach that other people have rights. They teach that rules should apply fairly. They teach that, you have to participate in democracy. They teach that history is meant to be more than just a scrapbook, or at least they should. So the question is not whether schools teach values. Of course they do. The question is which values get treated as normal and which values get treated as suspicious. And this is where the right has pulled off a very, very useful trick. Their worldview is presented as common sense. Everyone else's worldview is presented as politics. If a teacher talks about inclusion, that is political. But if PragerU talks about traditional values, well, that's neutral. If a lesson discusses the continuing effects of racism, that is very political. But if a lesson actively minimizes those effects, well, that's balance. If a school teaches climate science, that's political. If a conservative resource casts doubt on things like environmental regulation or climate action, well, that's just critical thinking. If a student learns about, labor exploitation, that's framed as class warfare. If they learn that only capitalism rewards hard work and innovation, well, that's just, that's economics. That is not removing politics from the classroom. That is giving one politics a fake mustache and waving it through security. And I think that this deserves some anger because teachers and librarians have paid a price for this manufactured panic. They have been harassed at school board meetings. They have been accused of corrupting children. And far worse. I mean, we've heard all accusations of everything from grooming to forced, trans surgeries at school and crazy nonsense like that. They've watched ordinary books become political evidence. They have had their very professionalism questioned by people who often haven't even read the materials that they're ranting and raving about. And then, from the same side of the political universe comes PragerU Kids, a conservative media organization, creates lessons for kids about history and values and capitalism and race and religion. And suddenly the people who built an entire, political plank around fear of indoctrination discover a deep appreciation for supplemental resources. I mean, that is not principle, that is preference. They do not object to children being shaped. They object to children being shaped by anyone else. And you can see that in the larger education wars. Book bans aren't just about books. The panic over critical race theory it was not just about critical race theory, especially since many of the loudest people yelling about it couldn't even define it. Anti-DEI laws are not just about training seminars. The attacks on teachers are not just about individual classroom disputes. These fights are about control over the story. What children are allowed to know, what parts of history are treated as central, which identities are treated as normal, which injustices are treated as real or ongoing, which questions are encouraged and which questions are punished. And PragerU fits neatly into that fight because it offers the right, a polished educational package that reinforces all of its preferred answers. that is why I can't just stop at PragerU as conservative. That's obvious. The deeper issue is that PragerU's politics are being offered as education by people who call other people's politics indoctrination. And if you call that anything besides hypocrisy, then I don't know if you understand what that word means. And it's not a small hypocrisy. It's the kind that reveals the actual project. If you truly believe children deserve honest education, you should want them to encounter complexity. You should want them to understand competing arguments. You should want history taught with enough context that patriotism doesn't require you to have amnesia. You should want economics taught with enough honesty that capitalism isn't demonized, but it also isn't worshipped. You should want civics taught in a way that produces citizens, not loyalists. But if your goal is control, then complexity is a big threat. Context can be a threat. Teachers can be a threat. Libraries can be a threat. And any child who learns to ask the question, who benefits from this version of the story, becomes a problem. That is why the indoctrination alarm only rings one way. Not because schools are suddenly neutral when conservatives get involved, but because indoctrination was never being used as a consistent standard. It was just a buzzword, a scary sounding buzzword being used as a weapon. And the easiest way to see that is to look at what PragerU is actually teaching. Now, not in every video, not in every clip, we're not doing a 9-hour hostage situation with the playlist here, but if PragerU Kids is being treated as educational material, and if PragerU, more broadly, is part of the worldview behind those materials, then it's fair to examine the ideas that keep showing up. And there are 3 big ones that stand out. Empathy as danger, racism as exaggerated, and capitalism as moral common sense. So let's start with empathy. PragerU has a video called Suicidal Empathy. Now, that phrase has come up on this podcast before. This particular video features someone named Gad Sad. PragerU's own description says that empathy is a noble virtue, but that it can lead people astray, even fatally, and that misdirected empathy endangers Western civilization itself. Now, outside of the PragerU universe, SAD has also promoted this argument in connection with immigration and DEI and gender identity, crime, homelessness, a number of other culture war issues. Now, there is a reasonable version of this discussion. Good intentions do not automatically make good policy. A compassionate idea can still fail. A policy meant to help people can have unintended consequences. Adults should be able to say those things without everyone reaching for a torch. However, suicidal empathy is not neutral phrasing. That phrase does something. It makes compassion sound reckless. It suggests that empathy, especially empathy aimed at the wrong people, can become a civilizational threat. And notice where this warning tends to appear. Not when the subject is too much empathy for corporations, not when the subject is government bending over backwards for billionaires, not when powerful people get endless benefit of the doubt. The warning usually shows up when compassion is directed towards immigrants, refugees, poor people, incarcerated people, LGBTQ people, people dealing with addiction, homelessness, or groups asking the country to confront, some grievance or unpaid moral bill. That's not just a policy argument. That is a moral training exercise. It teaches people to look at suffering and ask, is this person manipulating me? Before you get to any questions like, what exactly happened here? And if that becomes part of the educational ecosystem for kids, we should not shrug. Empathy is not a substitute for policy, but it is one of the things that keeps policy from becoming cold and cruel. I mean, sure, a society without empathy can still be efficient. A meat grinder is efficient. The better lesson for kids is not feel everything and think nothing. The better lesson is care enough to look closely and think clearly so that you can help wisely. That is a very different message than teaching children that compassion might be how civilization will collapse. The second example deals with slavery and racism. And this is where PragerU Kids has drawn a lot of criticism. PBS NewsHour covered concerns about PragerU's educational videos and highlighted a particular cartoon about Christopher Columbus. And in this cartoon, an animated Columbus responds to a question about slavery by saying, quote, "Being taken as a slave is better than being killed, no?" End quote. The same PBS segment discussed PragerU's broader framing of slavery as a worldwide practice and included historians criticizing that framing for leaving out important context, including that the United States was one of the last Western countries to abolish slavery. And that, I don't think that is a small problem. When you teach children about slavery, context matters. But context cannot become like a soft landing pad for the moral horror that slavery was. Yes, slavery existed in many parts of the world. Yes, people in the past lived within different moral systems. And yes, history is complicated, but American slavery was not a side note in someone else's story. It was central to American wealth, law, land, politics, policing, and race, of course. It shaped the Constitution. It shaped Congress. It shaped the courts. It shaped who could own property and who could build wealth and who could vote and who could move freely from one place to another, whose body could be treated as capital. And after slavery came black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow, lynchings, segregation, redlining, voter suppression, and discrimination that did not politely evaporate when America finally decided to update the brochure. So if every educational material rushes to say everyone did slavery or America helped end slavery without making students sit with the specific American system and its aftermath, that is anything but balance. It's PR, it's reputation management. The issue is not that children should be taught to hate America. That's nonsense. That is the lazy rebuttal. The issue is that children cannot understand America if the ugliest parts are reduced to background noise. Patriotism that depends on amnesia or soft focus is not strong. It's very fragile. It needs the lights dimmed. And this matters because children are not just learning facts, they're learning moral weights. If slavery is presented mainly as something old and global and resolved, then later conversations about systemic racism automatically sound excessive. If racism is treated as a mostly solved problem, then civil rights demands just sound like petty grievances. If America gets moved too quickly into the hero role, then the people asking for accountability can be framed as the problem. And that is not accidental. That is how a worldview gets built. And the third example is capitalism. PragerU strongly promotes free market capitalism. Its Capitalism 101 page describes capitalism as a force that created prosperity and it says it could help wipe out poverty in a generation. It's Why Capitalism Works video argues that capitalism succeeds because entrepreneurs must satisfy customers' needs and desires, and claims that only capitalism can create prosperity societies want. And again, there is a fair version of that lesson. Capitalism has produced enormous innovation. Markets can coordinate activity in powerful ways, and entrepreneurship can solve real problems. Competition can improve goods and services. A serious economics class can and should teach all of that. But if that is all that students hear, they are not getting economics. They're getting salesmanship. Because capitalism also has a history of exploitation, child labor, unsafe working conditions, union busting, wage theft, monopolies, environmental destruction, regulatory issues, medical bankruptcy, housing markets that can turn, shelter into speculation, companies that will happily privatize profit and socialize the cleanup bill if they aren't actively prevented from doing that. Markets do not automatically protect human dignity. People do that, and laws do that, and unions and regulations, social movements. Democratic pressure does that. Capitalism can produce wealth. It can also concentrate power. It can reward innovation, but it can also reward cruelty if cruelty happens to be profitable. It can meet consumer demand. It can also manufacture demand. It can exploit desperation. It can leave entire communities in the dust when the numbers say that it should move on. Teaching capitalism honestly does not mean teaching kids that capitalism is evil. That's ridiculous. It means teaching them capitalism is a system with trade-offs. It's not a sacred force that turns selfishness into public good with a Harry Potter spell. And that is the larger pattern. These three examples, they're not random. Together, they start to form a worldview. Empathy is noble but dangerous when it points towards the wrong people. Racism happened, but its continuing effects are very much overstated. Capitalism is freedom, while government intervention is suspicion-worthy. America is exceptional, and the people asking uncomfortable questions are usually the ones being divisive. That is the lesson underneath the lessons. And if adults want to consume that worldview, that is 100% fine. Adults can pick their media diet. But when those ideas with those lessons are packaged for kids as educational material and promoted by the same movement that calls everyone else's worldview indoctrination, the hypocrisy is not theoretical. It's sitting right there in the classroom with the kids. And here's where we have to zoom out, because the point of PragerU Kids is not that one video changes one child's mind in one afternoon. That's far too simple. Also, anyone who has ever tried to get a child to remember where they left their hoodie knows minds don't always work on command, especially young minds. This is slower than that. The goal is not necessarily to make a third grader walk home reciting talking points. The goal is to shape the assumptions that that child carries forward. What feels normal? What feels radical? What seems trustworthy? What seems dangerous? Which version of American history feels patriotic? Which questions feel disrespectful? Which people deserve empathy? Which people should be suspected of abusing that empathy? That is the long game. And the right understands this perfectly. That is why it fights so intensely over schools. Not because schools suddenly became political last Tuesday. Schools have always shaped civic life. The argument is over what kind of civic life they shape. That is why there are fights over libraries, fights over history standards and teacher training and DEI and race and gender, fights over whether students should learn that American ideals and American conduct have not always matched. All these things are not disconnected skirmishes. They are part of a larger battle over the starting point. If you can define the starting point, you have already influenced the argument. If a child grows up believing that capitalism simply equals freedom, then regulation, of course, sounds like an attack on that freedom. If a child grows up believing that racism is mostly past tense, then racial justice just sounds like nonsense or a resentment. If a child is raised to believe empathy is dangerous when aimed at outsiders, then, cruelty can be repackaged as caution or realism. If a child is taught to believe that criticism of America means that you hate America, then honest history does sound like betrayal. And that's not simply education. That is worldview construction. And no, this does not mean that every child exposed to PragerU becomes a conservative voter. That is cartoon logic. Kids are not vending machines where you insert a worksheet and receive a future school board candidate. But early framing matters. The first version of a story often becomes the version everything else has to fight against. That is why this is not about tomorrow. This is about 10 years from now or 20 years from now. The future voter, the future parent, the future teacher, the future school board member, the future uncle sitting at Thanksgiving saying, I just think they made everything about race now, without remembering where that instinct first came from. This is what long-range ideological work looks like. It doesn't always arrive with a campaign sign. Sometimes it arrives in a video that's 5 minutes long, a worksheet, a cheerful little lesson about American values that quietly teaches children which facts are trustworthy and which ones are not. And again, the answer is not to ban conservative ideas from schools. Absolutely not. That would be its own atrocity in and of itself, its own intellectual cowardice. Students should learn conservative arguments. They should learn progressive arguments. They should learn why people disagree, and that disagreement isn't always bad. They should learn how to compare competing claims and test evidence and recognize framing and notice when things are omitted. That's the difference between education and indoctrination. Education gives students tools. Indoctrination gives them conclusions and punishes the questions that work against those conclusions. That is why PragerU belongs in this larger conversation about power, because the same people who rage against this grooming and indoctrination of our kids do not seem to want children protected from this ideology, because they agree with this ideology. They want children protected from what they consider to be the wrong ideology. And if they can get their worldview in early and quietly enough, wrapped in, patriotic language and labeled as supplemental education, then they don't have to win every future argument from scratch. They have already helped decide what sounds reasonable before any conversation even starts. All right, so let's wrap this up here. PragerU is not the problem because it is conservative. Conservative ideas belong in public discussion. Students should learn what conservatives believe. They should learn what liberals believe. They should learn what socialists believe, what libertarians believe, what religious thinkers have argued, what secular thinkers have argued, what labor movements fought for, what business interests fought for, what civil rights movements demanded, and what governments have done in response. That is education. Real education does not protect students from disagreements. It prepares them for disagreements. The problem with PragerU Kids entering the school ecosystem is it's not that one side of the political spectrum exists. The problem is that an openly ideological media project isn't being treated as what it is. It's being treated by some on the right as a neutral education, while those same people label everyone else's lessons as indoctrination. That is the lie at the center of it. A teacher who mentions systemic racism is indoctrinating her kids. A conservative cartoon that softens the legacy of racism is considered supplemental material. And I've given you these examples before. It goes, this is a preference with a press release. And the reason this matters is because children deserve better than political content pretending that it has no politics. They deserve history that does not panic just because America looks guilty in a particular story. They deserve economics that does not confuse being rich with being virtuous. They deserve civics that teaches citizenship, not simply obedience. They deserve moral education that does not make compassion sound like a national security threat. They deserve adults honest enough to admit when they are teaching a worldview. Because that is really what this comes down to. If PragerU wants to make conservative media, fine. If parents want to show it at home, that is their choice. If adults want to watch it, share it, argue with it, or build their worldview around it, that is the messy freedom of living in a democracy. But when that content is designed for children, packaged for classrooms, and promoted by the same movement that has spent years terrorizing teachers over indoctrination, then we have every right to call out the hypocrisy. They were never, ever against indoctrination. They were against losing control of it. And the next time someone says they just want politics out of the classroom, then ask the follow-up question, whose politics? Because if honest history is political, but patriotic mythology isn't, if inclusion is political, but exclusion is dressed up as tradition, if climate science is political, but fossil fuel friendly doubt is not, if empathy is political, but suspicion isn't, if teaching the failures of capitalism is political, but praising capitalism without mentioning its negatives is not, then the game is not hard to see here. They did not cancel the indoctrination order. They changed the shipping address. And they sent it straight to kids. All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I am so grateful that you did, and I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject. I would love to hear, did you know about PragerU? Do you have thoughts on PragerU or about the bigger conversation here? Do you have thoughts on anything about the podcast, compliments, critiques, suggestions, whatever? If you go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, and go to the contacts page, you can either use the social media links or the email address to reach out to the podcast and let me know your thoughts. While you're there, you can go to the episodes section and you can stream or download any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the first one. And there is the blog section, which I think is very important because when I post about today's episode, as with any episode, I'm going to put all of the sources that I used. And I think in today's age, knowing where the information that you're listening to comes from is extremely important. I'll be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.